On the morning of July 6, 1892, the Monongahela River ran red. Not with iron ore, not with the rust of industry, but with the blood of men who had built Andrew Carnegie's fortune with their bare hands. Carnegie was not there to see it. He was in Scotland, fishing on a highland estate, insulated by an ocean and a carefully constructed alibi. But the massacre at Homestead, Pennsylvania, the single most violent labor conflict in American history, would follow him for the rest of his life. It would haunt his sleep, shadow his philanthropy, and eventually hollow out the legacy he spent $350 million trying to build. This is the story of a man who wanted to be remembered as a saint, and the single day in July that made sure he never would be. Andrew Carnegie was born in Dunfermline, Scotland, in 1835, the son of a linen weaver whose livelihood was destroyed by the Industrial Revolution. The irony is almost unbearable. The machines that shattered his father's world were the same machines Carnegie would one day wield like weapons. His family arrived in America in 1848, penniless and desperate, settling in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, a grimy industrial town across the river from Pittsburgh. Carnegie was 13 years old. He went to work immediately, first as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, then as a telegraph messenger, then as a telegraph operator. He was fast, ambitious, and utterly without sentimentality about money. He understood from the beginning that capital was power, and that power was the only thing in America that could not be taken from you once you had enough of it. By the time he was in his 30s, Carnegie had already made and lost and rebuilt several fortunes. He had invested in railroads, in sleeping cars, in iron bridges. He had the gift of recognizing what the country needed before the country knew it needed it. And what America needed in the years after the Civil War was steel. Not iron, not wood, not brick, steel. Carnegie threw himself into the steel business with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. He hired the best engineers, poached the best metallurgists, and relentlessly drove down costs at every stage of production. He was famous for walking the floor of his mills, asking workers for ideas to improve efficiency, then implementing those ideas and cutting the workforce that had made them possible. He smiled while he did it. He always smiled. By 1892, the Carnegie Steel Company dominated American industry. The main facility, the Homestead Steel Works, sat on the south bank of the Monongahela River, 8 miles from Pittsburgh. It was a city within a city, a roaring inferno of furnaces and cranes and molten metal that employed nearly 4,000 men. Thou were skilled workers, men who had spent decades mastering the art of steel production. They were also union men, members of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the most powerful trade unions in the country. And that, for Carnegie and his lieutenant Henry Clay Frick, was a problem. Carnegie had a complicated relationship with labor. In public, he wrote essays praising workers, endorsing their right to organize, positioning himself as a progressive employer who believed in the dignity of the working man. His essay titled The Gospel of Wealth, published in 1889, argued that the rich had a moral obligation to use their fortunes for the public good. He was celebrated in newspapers as a philosopher of capitalism, a man who had risen from poverty and had not forgotten where he came from. But in private, in the letters he sent to Frick, in the margins of financial reports, a different Carnegie emerged. A Carnegie who viewed unions as obstacles to profit. A Carnegie who understood that the real cost of labor was not wages but power, and that the amalgamated association had too much of it. In June of 1892, Carnegie set the trap. He authorized Frick to negotiate a new contract with the union, but the terms he approved were designed to fail. Wage cuts of up to 26%, restrictions on union membership, a revised pay scale tied to steel prices that would effectively gut the union's influence over working conditions. Carnegie then boarded a ship to Scotland, leaving Frick in charge. Whether this was a deliberate strategy to maintain plausible deniability, or simply the act of a man who could not bear to watch what he had set in motion, is a question historians have debated for over a century. The answer is probably both. Frick was everything Carnegie was not. Where Carnegie was charming and philosophical and obsessed with his public image, Frick was cold, direct, and entirely indifferent to how he was perceived. He had made his own fortune in coke production, supplying Carnegie's furnaces with the fuel they needed, and he had broken strikes before with a ruthlessness that bordered on pleasure. He did not negotiate with unions. He defeated them. When talks with the Amalgamated Association broke down on June 28th, Frick locked the workers out of the Homestead plant and began constructing what workers immediately nicknamed Fort Frick, a 3-mile perimeter of wooden fencing, topped with barbed wire, complete with watchtowers and holes cut for rifles. He had already arranged for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to send 300 agents by barge up the Monongahela River to take control of the plant. The workers were waiting for them. In the early hours of July 6, 1892, 2 barges carrying 300 Pinkerton agents attempted to land at the Homestead plant. They were met by several thousand workers and their families who had been watching the river all night. What followed was a battle that lasted 14 hours. Workers fired rifles and a cannon they had somehow acquired. They poured oil on the river and set it alight. They hurled dynamite. The Pinkertons, many of whom had no idea what they had been hired for, attempted to surrender multiple times before finally being allowed to come ashore and run a gauntlet of furious workers and townspeople that left dozens of them beaten and bloodied. When the shooting finally stopped, 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons were dead. Dozens more were wounded on both sides. The Homestead plant was still in the hands of the Union. But Frick had already sent a telegram to the governor of Pennsylvania. 4 days later, 8,000 state militia arrived at Homestead and took control of the plant. Frick brought in replacement workers. The strike collapsed. By November, the Union was effectively destroyed, and it would not recover at Carnegie Steel for the next 4 decades. Carnegie received regular updates in Scotland throughout the crisis. His telegrams to Frick during this period are extraordinary documents of evasion and complicity. He praised Frick's handling of the situation. He wrote that he was with him every step of the way. And then, when the scale of the violence became public and the newspapers turned against him, he began the process of distancing himself that would occupy him for the rest of his life. He told reporters he had been powerless in Scotland, that Frick had acted independently, that he would have handled things differently, None of it was true, and the workers of Homestead knew it. On July 23, 1892, a young anarchist named Alexander Berkman walked into Frick's office in Pittsburgh and shot him twice and stabbed him 3 times. Frick survived, returned to work the same day, and the attack was used by newspapers to turn public sympathy away from the strikers and toward the Carnegie Steel Company. But Carnegie, reading his press from Scotland, understood what had happened in a way the newspapers did not. The violence at Homestead had not been caused by anarchists. It had been caused by the conditions he had created and the strategy he had approved. Berkman's attack was simply the most visible symptom of a deeper wound. Carnegie returned to America in the autumn of 1892, a diminished man in ways only he could fully appreciate. His friend and intellectual hero Herbert Spencer had written to congratulate him on breaking the Union. Mark Twain had not. William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister whom Carnegie had courted assiduously, went conspicuously silent. The working men of Pittsburgh, the men who had read his essays about the dignity of labor and believed them, now called him a hypocrite to his face. Carnegie biographer David Nassau has written that Homestead broke something in Carnegie that was never fully repaired. The public persona of the benevolent industrialist had been revealed as a construction, and Carnegie knew it, even if he could never admit it. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of compensatory philanthropy in the history of American wealth. Carnegie had already given money to libraries before Homestead. After Homestead, he gave with a compulsive urgency that his associates found alarming. Between 1901, when he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, and his death in 1919, he gave away approximately $350 million. He funded the construction of 2,509 public libraries across the United States, Britain, and the wider world. He endowed universities, concert halls, scientific institutes, and peace foundations. He established the Carnegie Hero Fund to honor ordinary people who risked their lives to save others. He wrote and lectured and campaigned for international peace with the fervor of a man trying to outrun something. The libraries are the most revealing. Carnegie had educated himself in a private library as a boy in Pittsburgh, borrowing books from a local businessman named Colonel James Anderson, who opened his collection to working boys on Saturday afternoons. Carnegie spoke about this constantly, used it to justify the library program as spiritual restitution. Give a man a library, and you give him the tools to rise as I rose. The circularity of this reasoning, the way it located the solution to poverty in individual self-improvement, rather than in the structural conditions Carnegie himself had created, was either a profound philosophical blind spot or a very convenient one. The workers of Homestead received one of Carnegie's libraries. It was built in 1898, 6 years after the massacre, in the town where his Pinkerton agents had shot 7 of their fathers and brothers and neighbors. Carnegie attended the dedication ceremony. Contemporary accounts describe him smiling and shaking hands and speaking about the transformative power of knowledge. No one in the official photographs appears to be smiling back. Frick and Carnegie had a catastrophic falling out in 1900 over a business dispute that had nothing to do with Homestead, but everything to do with the kind of men they both were. Frick accused Carnegie of swindling him. Carnegie accused Frick of disloyalty. Frick reportedly told Carnegie, and this quote has echoed through history, "I will meet you in hell." They never spoke again. When Carnegie heard that Frick was dying in December 1919, he sent a message asking if they might reconcile. Frick sent back 4 words, "Tell him to go to hell." Carnegie died 3 months later, having never received his absolution. The question that haunts the Carnegie story is the same question that haunts all great American fortunes built in the Gilded Age. Was it possible to accumulate that kind of wealth without doing that kind of harm? Carnegie's defenders argue that he was a man of his time, that the brutal suppression of labor was standard practice in 1892, that his philanthropy was genuine and transformative, and has enriched the lives of millions of people who never heard of Homestead. His critics argue that the philanthropy was precisely the problem, that it allowed Carnegie and the class he represented to launder their reputations without ever addressing the conditions that had made their fortunes possible. That giving away libraries is not the same thing as paying workers a living wage. That 2,500 libraries cannot balance the ledger against 14 hours of rifle fire on the Monongahela River. What is undeniable is that Carnegie spent the last 27 years of his life in a state of psychological siege. He wrote about Homestead only obliquely, burying references to it in the passive voice and the language of regret without admission. His autobiography, published posthumously in 1920, dedicates more space to his friendship with Matthew Arnold than to the single most consequential event of his business career. The silence is more revealing than any confession could have been. In his final years, Carnegie campaigned obsessively for world peace, convinced that the great powers of Europe and America could be persuaded to submit their disputes to international arbitration rather than war. He poured money into peace organizations, wrote letters to Kaiser Wilhelm, corresponded with presidents and prime ministers. When the First World War began in August 1914, Carnegie suffered what his biographers describe as a complete psychological collapse. He had been wrong about everything. Peace was not coming. The libraries and the concert halls and the hero funds had not civilized the powerful. The powerful had simply used them as decoration. He retreated to his estate in Massachusetts, stopped reading newspapers, and spent his last years in a silence that those around him found deeply unsettling. He died on August 11, 1919, in Lenox, Massachusetts. He was 83 years old. He had given away 90% of his fortune. He had built institutions that still bear his name on every continent. And somewhere in the town of Homestead, Pennsylvania, the Carnegie Library he had dedicated with a smile in 1898 was still standing, its shelves full of books, its reading rooms open to the grandchildren of the men his Pinkertons had shot on the river. The building is still there today. The steel mill is gone, demolished in the 1980s when the American steel industry collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The workers who replaced the strikers of 1892 and their children and their grandchildren eventually lost their jobs anyway, to to automation and outsourcing, and the same relentless logic of cost reduction that Carnegie had practiced with such devastating efficiency a century before. The library outlasted the mill. Whether that is a testament to Carnegie's vision or the final irony of his legacy depends entirely on what you believe philanthropy is for. To understand why Carnegie could never fully escape Homestead, you have to understand what it meant to the people who lived through it. This was not simply a labor dispute that turned violent. It was a public execution of an idea. The idea that a man who had risen from poverty would govern his empire differently than the men born into wealth. Carnegie had sold that idea aggressively, built his entire public identity around it. He was not a robber baron, he insisted. He was a working man who had made good and had not forgotten what it felt like to be poor. The workers at Homestead had believed him. Many had read his essays. Some had quoted his words back to him in the press during the strike, holding him to promises he had made in print and then broken in practice. That betrayal was not abstract. It was personal. The scale of what Carnegie built after 1892 is staggering even by modern standards. Between 1883 and 1929, Carnegie funds supported the construction of 2,509 library buildings across the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and beyond. In many small American towns, the Carnegie Library was the most substantial public building ever constructed there. Children who had never seen the inside of a proper school could find books and reference materials that would have been accessible only to the wealthy a generation before. The practical impact on American literacy is beyond dispute. But Carnegie was not naive enough to believe that libraries alone would silence his critics. In 1902, he wrote a long private letter to a friend in which he came closer than anywhere else to acknowledging what had happened. He described Homestead as the one great blot on his life. He wrote that he had been in Scotland and had trusted others to handle matters, and that things had gone in a direction he had not intended. Even in private, he could not bring himself to say the words directly. He had sanctioned the lockout. He had approved the wage cuts. He had known Frick would use force. The passive voice was not a grammatical choice. It was a psychological necessity. The men who survived Homestead did not use the passive voice. Hugh O'Donnell, the union leader who had tried to negotiate a settlement, gave congressional testimony in August 1892 that made front pages across the country. O'Donnell named names. He described meetings. He explained that the Pinkerton invasion had not been a response to Union violence but its cause, and that the decision to deploy armed agents against workers had been made weeks in advance by men sitting in comfortable offices far from the river. O'Donnell lost everything. He was blacklisted from the steel industry. Carnegie, who had praised the dignity of labor in print, never acknowledged him. The congressional investigation into Homestead produced hundreds of pages of testimony, but no criminal charges. Frick and Carnegie were untouchable in the legal sense. America in 1892 had no meaningful labor law, no regulation of private security forces, no minimum wage, no framework for collective bargaining. What the workers had was the moral argument, and moral arguments, Carnegie had learned, could be answered with enough stone and enough carefully worded press releases. What is remarkable looking back is how quickly the official narrative shifted. Within months of the massacre, the story that dominated newspapers was not the Pinkerton invasion or the wage cuts or the destruction of the Union. It was Alexander Berkman's attack on Frick. Berkman was an anarchist with no connection to the Amalgamated Association, a young man who had acted out of ideological conviction rather than personal grievance. But his attack provided exactly the reframing that Carnegie needed. Suddenly, the story was about anarchist violence, about the threat to order and property posed by radical elements within the labor movement. The workers of Homestead, who had organized peacefully for months before the lockout, who had fired back only after Pinkerton agents opened fire on them, were now tainted by association with the man they had never met. Carnegie understood how to use this. He simply allowed the reframing to happen and moved on. He sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for what was then the largest private transaction in American history. Morgan combined it with other steel interests to form United States Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar company in the world. Carnegie walked away with $480 million in bonds and spent the rest of his life giving it away. The higher purposes kept him busy but not satisfied. Carnegie threw himself into the peace movement with the same intensity he had once applied to driving down the cost of pig iron. He funded the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 1910. He built the Peace Palace at The Hague in 1913. He corresponded with heads of state and lobbied relentlessly for a world court that could settle disputes between nations without bloodshed. He was convinced that economic interdependence made large-scale war impossible. He made this argument with great confidence in the summer of 1914, weeks before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set the world on fire. The war destroyed him in the way that matters most, in the part of a man that believes his life has added up to something. He had given away $350 million to make the world more peaceful and more educated, and the world had responded by mobilizing the largest armies in human history and turning the industrial machinery that men like Carnegie had built into instruments of mass slaughter. The steel that had made his fortune was now making shells. The rational world he had believed in had turned out to be a story he had told himself. He spent his final years at Shadow Brook, his estate in Lenox, Massachusetts, largely withdrawn from public life. He stopped reading newspapers. Those who saw him described a man who had become very small, not in the physical sense, but in the sense of a man who had stopped pushing against the world. He died quietly on a summer morning in 1919, 4 months after the armistice, surrounded by his family. His legacy is exactly as complicated as he feared it would be. The libraries are real and they matter. The concert halls and universities carry his name and do genuine good. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace is still operating. These are not trivial things. They represent a genuine attempt, however compromised in its origins, to put enormous private wealth in service of the public good. But Homestead is also real. The 7 men who died on July 6, 1892, were real. The 4,000 workers who lost their union were real. The blacklist that destroyed Hugh O'Donnell's career was real. The telegram Carnegie sent from Scotland praising Frick was real. The autobiography that buried all of this in silence was real. Andrew Carnegie wanted to be remembered as the man who gave away his fortune. History remembers him as the man who had to. There is a difference, and it is the size of a river, and it runs red.